How to clean epoxy. This is what we're going to talk about today. Big subject. I get lots of emails and lots of questions. Hey, I've got a problem. How do I clean epoxy? Even myself, I get lots of problems. And I'm going to start by clarifying when we say cleaning epoxy, we're talking about three different types of epoxy. So before we move on, number one, working epoxy. That is the epoxy that you're actually on at the time you're working, you're painting, you're doing something with epoxy, and you get it all over your clothes, you get it over your shoes, you get it on some windowsill or something, and it needs cleaning. Second case is cured epoxy or dried epoxy. That's when, let's say, you go back after you finished your flooring project and you've managed to splash some epoxy on the wall, or you've managed to splash it on a door frame, even worse, or on some marble or something, or some sort of frame, and everyone's just freaking out. How are we going to clean the epoxy from the frame? And the final case is sticky epoxy. Let me tell you, that's probably the messiest and the one type of epoxy you don't want to have to clean. I'll get to that later. So we're going to start with working epoxy, but before we start, please, if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and subscribe now to our channel and click on that bell so you get notified. It helps to keep the channel moving and get more views. Thank you very much, and let's move. So working epoxy. Working epoxy, the best way to clean is while you're working, first of all, wear gloves. It's good for you. You're not going to get your hands dirty, because in the past I've gotten some epoxy on my hands, on my arms, on my wrists, and it's not that easy. I mean, the best way to clean it is if you always have a cloth or a towel with you, and you can just clean it on the cloth. Sometimes you may need to sort of insist a bit with thinner or solvent, or warm water is very useful. Although usually when you're on a project site, you don't have warm water available. So you have to resort to thinner or solvent, which is basically the same thing. There's different types of thinner. Personally, I recommend something like xylene. And the reason is because xylene is not very fast. It's not very flammable. Some people prefer acetone or alcohol. I'm a bit wary of these types because they are very, very flammable. They have a very annoying smell. Not the safest thing to be working with, and not the safest thing to be putting on your skin. Or not necessarily on your skin, any other tools or anything you want to clean while you're working with epoxy. Just go with a proper thinner and you should be fine with that. Again, you want to limit the use of thinners and solvents, but when you're working with epoxies, they are necessary. And let me just emphasize, we're talking about solvent-based epoxies. If you're working with a water-based epoxy, then just use water. That's why they're called water-based. Just use water and you will be able to clean the epoxy. Now we're going to the second case, and now I'm talking about cured epoxy or dried epoxy, although I know some people kind of get offended if I say dried epoxy because it's not the correct chemical term. Anyway, cured epoxy, this is when it happened to me recently. We did a project, and I had a new guy on my team that wasn't very careful, and we weren't really noticing, and he managed to splash some paint on some door frames. Basically our fault for not really having noticed it. But what ends up happening is you need to clean those door frames. And so how do you go about that? When the epoxy is splashed on the door frames, it's dried. And the biggest problem is not removing the epoxy. The biggest problem is by removing the epoxy, you will very likely damage the surface underneath. So whether we're talking about a door frame, or maybe you've splashed on a wall, or maybe you splashed on some other type of surface, the big problem is how do you remove it without damaging what's underneath? Now, my sort of go-to solution is industrial paint stripper. And the reason is these paint strippers come with lots of different solvents that kind of coexist, and they kind of collaborate into like breaking down the epoxy. So what you do here is you take a bit of paint stripper, you put it on the surface that you want to clean, you let it sit for 2 or 3 minutes, and then what will usually happen is the epoxy will start to wrinkle after a few minutes, and then you take a cloth or a little scraper and you gently kind of rub it away. That should be fine, although sometimes that may leave a kind of like a blushing mark on the back. So the surface that's been cleaned, it may not look as glossy as it used to afterwards. That is one risk. Now, another thing you can do to get rid of cured or dried epoxy is using a heat gun. the good thing with heat is because epoxy tends to last until 60 or 70 degrees Celsius and then it kind of breaks down. The great thing with a heat gun is you can just hold it near the epoxy and just as it slowly heats up, the epoxy will start to crack, and that is a way to sort of break it up and clean it. Keep in mind, do not combine, as I emphasize here, the solvent paint stripper with a heat gun. You do not want to combine these two. And the reason is because solvents are flammable, solvents tend to ignite at 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. A heat gun is going to be much hotter than that. You don't want any of that. So if you are going to remove epoxy, you either go with a paint stripper with a solvent, or you go with a heat gun. You don't go with both. Now, I've also listed here boiling water. So for example, if the surface is a flat surface and you want to get some epoxy removed from a flat floor surface, by pouring boiling water on the stain, it will help break up the epoxy. So pour some boiling water, let it sit for a bit, and then with a scraper, it'll be easier to remove. I found that's also helpful. So you can have like a water kettle, boil water, and pour it on top. And finally, sometimes even a scraper on its own will do the work, especially if the epoxy isn't that old. So let's say you applied it a day ago, you realize today, oh, I got this area dirty, I splashed some epoxy. If it's not too old, you can actually very carefully with a scraper, just kind of gently or with a little cutting knife, just kind of try to remove the epoxy without damaging the surface underneath. Let me just say that it's very difficult to not damage the surface underneath. You will always damage, but sometimes it's about assessing what's better. Do you want the epoxy stain to be visible, or do you prefer to have a surface underneath that may be a bit less glossy than it should be? So you need to kind of judge what's the best solution when you are dealing with cured epoxy. In fact, I recommend the best thing, of course, is before you start to paint your floor or to paint whatever you're coating, just put masking tape everywhere. Just spend those extra half hour putting masking tape and being very careful. It will save you so much hassle if you put masking tape around the areas. You'll have so much less hassle to deal with. And finally, now we're coming to sticky epoxy, which is the messiest, the worst. It is the type of epoxy you don't want to be cleaning. And believe me, if you look at the comments in various videos that I've posted on YouTube, everyone keeps on telling me, hey, I did this, someone did this, they didn't mix it properly, and now the floor is sticky and it stains and don't know what to do. Or this one guy wrote in and said, I messed up my wife's table. I was doing a clear epoxy on her table, and the epoxy didn't dry properly. Now what do I do? Help me, please. These things happen a lot. Judging by the comments, it's happened to me. You can check out some of my older videos where I talk about these disasters. How do you deal with sticky epoxy? Well, there's two things you need to do. One is, if the epoxy is sticky, you need to remove all the uncured stuff. So if it's kind of wet or sticky, with a scraper, just kind of remove as much as possible. Number two, once you removed it, then you wipe down with solvent. So you want to wipe it down, and the purpose here is you will need to recoat the surface. But before you recoat, you want the surface to be as clean as possible and to have as little residue as possible. Because if you have too much residue, then you will not have proper bonding of the old layer to the new layer. So you want to remove the uncured, the epoxy, wipe it down with solvent, and then let me just right here, recoat. That's the sticky epoxy. So summarizing, how do you deal with epoxy when you have to clean it? If it's working, you use thinner and solvent, warm water, remember to wear gloves. If you're working with cured epoxy, you need to clean cured epoxy. Well, number one solution is remember to use masking tape so you don't have to clean it afterwards. But if you do have to clean it, paint stripper is a good solution. Heating it is a good solution. Never combine the two. And finally, if you have sticky epoxy, the worst type, remove anything that hasn't cured, wipe it down, and recoat. And good luck to you. I have spent years dealing with these situations where you have to clean epoxy because you didn't do a good job. And I really want to emphasize the best thing you can do is prevention, prevention, prevention. So you don't have to come to this difficult situation where you have to clean epoxy afterwards. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'm going to post some links here and some links below to various videos about how to mix epoxy properly, how to avoid sticky epoxy, how to deal with disasters. I've got lots of videos, links posted for you. Thank you very much for watching.